A couple years back I had an idea for a game, which was a top-down arena PvP shooter, and it had two main mechanics. First of all, the bullets bounced, and second, you had to pick them back up. This was mainly just an idea for a game I wanted to play with my friends, but because that game didn't exist, I had to take it upon myself. So I spent a couple months cobbling features together until I had something that worked. And here it is. You can't actually play this game, I never ended up releasing it, and we'll get to all the reasons why soon. This is the main menu where you can choose the amount of rounds you want to play and choose the game mode. The deathmatch sort of strips the game to its bare minimum. You have a gun that shoots a ball, and to be able to shoot that ball again you have to go pick it up. You win by shooting the other player, and then you move on to the next round. The bouncy mode is just like deathmatch, except the balls bounce from walls 5 times before they stop. The flags mode is quite unnecessary because most of the time you end up shooting the other player anyway, but now you also have the option of winning by bringing their flag to your base. The Chaos game mode is probably the reason I'm making this video in the first place. It picks a random modifier every round to throw into the game, and this could be infinitely bouncing balls, backwards guns, constantly rotating guns, semi-automatic guns with infinite ammunition, upside down gameplay, or teleporting. The game doesn't actually tell what this modifier will be beforehand, so you just need to figure it out on the fly. Now this game mode happens to be really fun. It's one of those rare occasions where I feel like I'd play this for fun even if it wasn't my game. So there must be some people out there who think the same, right? But the thing about this game is that it works, but just barely. My intention was always just to make it work so that I could play it a couple times with friends, so I never concerned myself with making it work well. I took every shortcut that I could with this game, and that led to things that just don't work as well as they should for an actual release. Here's an example of the player death code. If you have any knowledge of coding, you'll know that this is horrible, and if you have any idea what's going on here, then please comment down below. The worst part is that this is just the player 1 code, and here's the player 2 code. They are two separate scripts and they have hard-coded differences. And this is just one example. The game is filled with these things that make it just barely work. And if I wanted to fix any of these things or add more functionality, I'd risk breaking the entire rest of the game and burning the whole thing down by So I'm throwing this whole thing out and starting again. And this time I'm actually gonna focus on making things well, instead of just throwing things together and seeing what sticks. Well, I might actually still need that. So the first thing I want to get right is controller allocation. And yeah, it sounds boring, but it's one of the biggest reasons I don't want to publish my old game. Godot, which is the game engine I'm using, differentiates between controllers, or joypads as it calls them, with an index starting from 0. The problem with Godot's default input mapping method is that you can choose which controller to use, but you can't change that on the fly, it's all hard-coded. This means that because the old game relies on this default input mapping, it just assigns controller 0 to the first player and controller 1 to the second one. And what these controllers are in reality is up to the game to decide. Now this is fine when you only have 2 controllers plugged in, but it becomes a problem when you have more than that. Now let's say I have these 3 controllers plugged in and the game decides that this is controller 0, this is controller 1, and this is controller 2. Even if you remove this controller from the computer, it doesn't change the indexes of the other 2, which means you just can't move one of the players until you restart the game and try again, hoping that the game picks better indices this time. So that's why controller allocation is number 1 on the list of things to get right this time. And because Godot doesn't have a way of doing this automatically, we'll have to do it ourselves. I'll put a video up soon on how to do this in Godot, but I'll just stick to the visualizations in this video. So let's start with the list of all controllers that are plugged in. We can print that out whenever it changes so we know a controller has been plugged in or taken out. I'll add in keyboard support as well, because some people just don't have this many controllers. Then we can also make a list of controllers that are assigned to players, and then we can just go through every controller that isn't already assigned to a player, and if it has a specific button pressed, we just add it to the list in the first available index. And then we can do pretty much the same with removing controllers. We just check a different list and use different buttons. And then we do all that but for the keyboard. So it works now, but this is kind of boring to look at, and this is just a PowerPoint slide. So now I'm gonna add the most important thing in any game, graphics. So now we have the player, and we can assign a controller to it, but ideally we would also be able to move the player, which is what the controllers are really for. So let's talk a little bit about joysticks and movement. This thing here represents a controller's joystick that we want to use for movement. You can see the X and Y values at the bottom, which range from -1 to 1. For demonstration purposes, let's round those down a little bit. Alright, so we can draw a line between the joystick's position and the center. This line points towards the movement direction, and its length can be used as the speed. Now what you'll notice is that this never really goes to 0, which means that you're always moving a little bit. And that's a problem that we can solve with a dead zone. So now when the speed goes below a certain amount, it just gets set to 0. Another problem we have is that the maximum speed fluctuates based on direction, and that just comes from little errors and differences in controllers and joysticks. We can fix that by normalizing the value, which just sets its length to 1 whenever it's above 0. So whenever the player is moving now, it's moving at the maximum speed. Now this is actually what I want for the game, since there's not much use in going slow, and it levels the playing field for keyboard and controller players. But if you want to be able to control your speed with the joystick, you can just pick the smaller of the dead zone and normalized values and use that. Thankfully, movement on the keyboard is a lot easier than this, and you just have to remember to normalize that as well so that going diagonally isn't faster. So now we can move the player and change the controllers or use the keyboard. We can also add another player to make this a little more in depth. And why stop there? We can add 6 more. So that's all for this video. Remember to subscribe, rate the video 5 stars on the App Store to get 25 free diamonds, and join me on the next episode where I add collisions. And maybe an animation?